So this evening on this snow day, we're doing the first of four sessions planned on meditation techniques. And the goal of this is to be not just theoretical, talk about what Jewish meditation is, so we could do that for hours, but also actually look at some of the techniques in a very basic way that one might use. So a couple introductory things to say before we do that. One is, what is meditation? And two is, what is Jewish meditation? So meditation, very simply, is thinking on purpose, controlled thought. That's not something we normally do, as silly as that might seem. Most of our lives, we walk around thinking automatically. We observe things, we relate to things. It all happens without us really intervening in an active, conscious way and going, oh, I'm going to think this. Once in a while, we actually sit down to contemplate. Maybe we have a thorny issue we're facing, or we have something really important that we need to decide about. We actually sit down and direct our thoughts. But the reason that feels exceptional is because it is, because most of the time we don't do that. And so all we mean when we say meditation is thinking on purpose in some way. Now, the goal is to enable us to access the sort of patterns of thought and patterns of thinking, which are subconscious, which we don't normally access. And there's two ways, broadly, that one can do that. One way is to try and empty out all the conscious bits, all the kind of automatic background noise, to just filter it out and slowly quiet and quiet and quiet and quiet, so you can be still and listen. And there's many meditation techniques that focus on stillness and listening. And the other approach is to overwhelm the system. It's the opposite, to put more and more and more and more information into it, to try and kind of crash the computer almost of our conscious brains. And in that moment in which our consciousness is overwhelmed, get some insight into our subconscious, almost like a trance state. So meditation in Judaism reflects both aspects, as it does in every culture and every religion, but it tends very heavily towards the second, towards the overwhelming, overstimulating type of meditation, which is unusual or unexpected for those of us who may have had experience with meditation primarily derived from Buddhist practice or from other Eastern practices, which tends to be, not always, but tends to be focused on stillness. If you think about the mystical practices of Islam and Judaism, although that's partially what we're here to learn about, but think about Islam and the Sufis, let's say the whirling dervishes, one of the sects of Sufism, right? The goal of dancing around in circles and singing and listening to music and chanting is exactly the same. It's to overwhelm the system. And that's ultimately where Jewish meditation tends to lie as well. So of the four sessions we're going to do, each of them is going to look at a different way of doing this stimulation. So tonight we're going to look at letters, numbers, and mental math, as promised on the flyer. Next time we're going to look at visualization and visuals. And after that, we'll talk about walking. Hopefully we'll actually be able to do the walking one in person and walk. And the last one will be focused on breath and body movements and postures. Right? Much of what we're going to eventually get to is actually not so different from something like yoga, in which we're using our body and the stimulation of trying to move a certain way to try and get to that state as well. In terms of what makes Jewish meditation unique, there's not a great deal about it, other than the fact that it's relying on Jewish texts and Jewish ways of thinking, and tends to be incorporated within prayer life that's typically part of Judaism. 99% of what's there is not taught, is not something we would have learned in Cheder growing up, is not something we do much in the synagogue. Maybe we should change that. Maybe we already are. And the problem is, what is taught, what's easily accessible if you Google Jewish meditation, is largely not actually meditation from the Jewish tradition, but meditation kind of drawn from general culture, in particular from Eastern and Buddhist culture, and then fit into Hebrew terminology. So you'll find a lot of mindfulness or stillness meditations drawn from Buddhist culture and adapted to Jewish ways of thinking by slapping on some Hebrew words. But actually, although there's nothing wrong with that, there's quite a bit of meditation within our own tradition, which just gets ignored. Now, in terms of where to find out more, there's one rabbi in particular who's been a great resource for bringing all of this stuff to the fore, particularly in English. That's Aryeh Kaplan. And he's got a great little book called Jewish Meditation. which definitely recommend. And the very advanced follow-up to that is Meditation and Kabbalah, which are both by Aryeh Kaplan, and both really great and authentic looks at traditional meditation techniques. And most of what we're going to look at this evening comes from those books in some way or another, although most of it's been adapted. So what I wanted to start with, after that kind of brief introduction, meditation, Jewish meditation, is looking at what the source ultimately of this tradition of letters and numbers and math is. And then we're going to try some examples for ourselves. Now, all of the things we're going to look at are actually, you have to learn a technique and practice it before you can really apply it in a meditative sense. So most of the things that we're going to do just as practice are things which the teachers of meditation in our tradition would suggest you have to kind of focus on for hours at a time, usually in total isolation by yourself, usually with lots of preparation. There's a common tradition that you have to be completely isolated for 72 hours and not have spoken a word out loud, and then you can begin to do these kind of meditations. That's not what we're doing right now, obviously. But what I want to show you is the techniques that would be used if you sought to pursue that kind of intensive, contemplative, almost aesthetic type of life. So I'm going to share some stuff with us. And by the way, if you have any questions or comments, it's really hard on Zoom, but you can either unmute yourself and shout out or use the chat, because I don't want to just hear myself talking the whole time. I'm sure you don't either. But what I want to start out with is looking at one particular source. And then we're going to look at how this is applied. So this is the most important source in thinking about what we mean when we say letters and numbers, which I'm going to call alphanumeric meditation, like code, letters and numbers, and why it is that is and where it comes from. So it comes from this text. This is the very beginning of a book called Sefer Yetzirah, the book of creation. Quick show of hands, anyone ever heard of Sefer Yetzirah before? Anyone ever heard a rabbi talk about it before? That isn't me. Okay, got a couple of them. I think they mostly went down on the caveat there. So Sefer Yetzirah is the oldest work of explicitly mystical Jewish thinking. It's probably 2nd century, so it's around the same time as the Mishnah, which is the center and obviously the basis of halachic Jewish life. Sefer Yetzirah is written probably around the same time and written in much the same style as the Mishnah, meaning it's very short, it's very brief, and it leaves a lot to the imagination. But what it does is introduce a conception of the universe, which is very, very, very important to all alphanumeric approaches to meditation that follow. Okay, so I just want to look at these first two Mishnayot, these first two passages from it. This is the first one. It's a very famous line that opens with Bishloshim Ushtaim Sivot Pliot, right, with 32 mystical paths of wisdom. Remember that number. And then we have a whole list of God's names, right? And the verb engrave. Engrave, Yah, Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, living God, King of the universe, El Shaddai, merciful and gracious, high and exalted, dwelling in eternity. His name is holy. Ignore that little study that ended up there at the end. God is holy and created the universe with 3 books, with text, Sefer, with numbers, Sfar, and with story, Sipor. Okay? This should not make any sense. It doesn't make any sense. Hebrew speakers will be aware of the fact that this last sentiment here, I'm just going to highlight in Hebrew, Bishlosha Sfarim, B'Sefer, Uvisfar, Sipor. All of those are obviously the same root, right? Samech Fe Resh, which is to count or to recount, i.e. to tell, or to tell a story. And that's what it's playing on, is this idea that you can have these 3 different notions of text, number, and story, which are all interchangeable, which we're going to see what that means. The key thing, though, the only thing I want us to focus on about this very strange ancient text right now is the first 2 words with 32 mystical paths. Anyone know where we get the 32 from? Where that number is from? Why 32? What does that mean? No. So mentioned we were talking about alphanumeric code here, and that's what our 32 is. It's the 22 letters and 10 numbers. And you can see that in the very next Mishnah. Just briefly have it here. 10 numbers of nothingness and 22 foundation letters. 3 mothers, 7 doubles, 12 elementals. That's a traditional way of dividing up the letters in the alphabet. What matters is the fact that we're talking about 22 letters. There's 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet and 10 numbers. And here's what's actually happening behind this, is that this text, Sefer Yetzirah, believes, and will go on to expand, that everything in the universe is made up of letters and numbers. Alphanumeric code. Actually not so different from programming code in some way, if that helps to think about it. The actual theology of this text is that if you could open up matter and open up all the things around us in a scientific way, if you could get to the very root of what's inside the atoms and the protons and the neutrons and the quarks and whatever, what you'd find are letters and numbers. Something very Jewish about that, by the way, which I love, right? The reason there's something very Jewish about that is because it is something very Jewish and very ancient. But the idea is actually that the foundation, the building blocks of all reality are letters and numbers. Letters and numbers combined together. Think of it, if you think of the periodic table, right, of chemical elements, which we all learn in school, and which probably you would say if you were asked, is the building block of all reality, right? Is it ultimately all those elements combined together, those molecules? What they're thinking about is similar to a periodic table, except there's 22 letters, Aleph through Tav, and 10 numbers. And that's their periodic table. And the combination of those letters and numbers is what creates things. It actually has the power of creation. Now, the basis of this, of course, is Genesis itself. How does God make stuff? Talking, right? Our God is really weird. Most gods in the ancient world, most ancient texts, talk about God making something out of clay or making something out of different elements, out of real physical material substances. Our God talks, right? If you look carefully at the very beginning of Genesis, it all happens through speech. God says something and it happens, which is why, for instance, in our prayers, we say, Baruch she'amar v'haya ha'olam. Blessed is the one who spoke and the world came to be. Another implication of this, anyone heard of abracadabra before? Abracadabra, the magician's thing, yes? Abracadabra is Aramaic, abracadabra, which means I speak and I create, which is based on this same notion from Sefer Yetzirah, that speech itself, language, is what creates. It's magic, right? Literal magic. Speech, language, numbers, letters combined together has the power to create. Now, that's actually a really deep concept that we could spend a really long time on. And ultimately, if it's something that speaks to you and that you're convinced by, it really does change the way you see the world around you, if you see everything as being linguistic in its expression. But that's a more philosophical conversation. What I'm interested to show you is what this means for meditation practices, because this is the foundation of so much of what we might call alphanumeric meditation, focused on numbers and letters. So the first thing is gematria. Zoom out a little bit. Hopefully you can see this. So gematria is a system of assigning numbers to letters. Okay, this is our Hebrew Aleph Bet, starting here in the upper right quarter. Aleph Bet Gimel Daled Hey Vav Zayin Chet Tet Yud. Hebrew class, by the way, is at 6:30. If any of this isn't familiar to you and you want to learn more about it, and the system of gematria assigns a number to each of those things, and you can see them here. Aleph is 1, Bet is 2, through the first 10, and then following 10, it then goes to 20, 30. It jumps by 10s, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100. And following 100, it then jumps by hundreds for the last 3 letters, 200, 300, 400. People seen this before? Heard about this before? We've talked about this before. What this means as a system is that you can convert any letter or any word or any sentence or any book into a mathematical expression. Right? So your name is a number. Everything is a number, and every number can be articulated as a variety of words. And one of the most basic meditation techniques is just to do this a lot. So as I mentioned a little bit before, one thing that's very common is that the teachers in this meditation school, and particularly there's a guy named Abraham Abulafia, who is a big influence in the school. He's a medieval rabbi. His recommendation is as follows: that you find an abandoned building in a very distant place where you can scream at the top of your lungs and no one will hear you, in a horror movie sense. You go there by yourself and spend at least 3 days fasting completely, only water. You dress completely in white garments, and then you sit down at midnight on the third day in total darkness, in total isolation, with a candle and a piece of paper and a pen. And without stopping, you simply take words that come into your mind and convert them into numbers, and then convert the number that you have into another word, and then convert that word into another number, and then convert that number into another word, and you keep going and going and going and going. Now, this might seem bonkers, but if you do that nonstop, especially when you're sleep deprived and hungry for many, many hours, you will enter a sort of trance fugue state. And that is the goal. We're not going to go for the trance state this evening. That would be very irresponsible of us. But what I would like us to do is to take a few minutes to do a little bit about yourselves. We got 6 words here, and you have the numbers right next to you. You have a piece of paper and pen. Just take literally 2 minutes and try and figure out what the numbers are for these words you see in front of you. You have everything you need, hopefully, to be able to do the math. Replace each letter with its number, and add up the letters of the word to see what they add up to. Final letters, by the way, count the same as their normal form. So there's a final noon here. That's meant to be a final noon. I don't know if you can see that. It looks like a vav, but it's meant to be a noon. And this is a final mem here. So it counts just the same as a mem. Not a trick. You didn't think you'd be doing math tonight. Ha! It's not exactly math, though, is it? It's cryptography. Right? It's coding, changing one thing into another.
Can I just say something?
Please, Jackie.
Yeah, it's to say that when we do any sort of mathematical exercise, it's the sort of thing that if we were walking and we were trying to do it in our heads, we would actually have to stop walking because because of the thought processes. And it means that it's a very, very good way, if we can do it, of focusing on something and reducing anxiety, because it's very difficult to be worrying about stuff when you're trying to work out mathematical problems, which is why Sudoku is very good.
Yes.
Crossword puzzles are less good.
Yes.
Very complicated knitting patterns are good.
Those are meditations, yes.
Anything that's engaging and concentrates a part of the brain which is not the part of the brain that we use for worrying about stuff. So absolutely. It's excellent.
Absolutely. That is the kind of meditation we're talking about. Is that, and this is very simple, right? But if I gave you instead 3 chapters from the book of Isaiah and you had to convert that into a mathematical equation, it would be all consuming, especially if you're in total isolation and total silence and all you have is that text in front of you, no distractions. And the idea is that it fills up 100% of your brain's working capacity. And what happens when your brain is 100% occupied is that other things from your subconscious float up without you realizing, passively come to the surface. Just as you have a lot of thoughts while you're in the shower, right? Insights, because you're busy doing something, you're not thinking on purpose, so you think by accident. And this is how most of these meditation techniques work as well. So let's check our work a little bit. I know everyone probably could spend a long time on this, but our first word here, who can tell me what the word is and what it adds up to?
Torah.
Torah, Diana, what does it add up to? What's the number it equals?
I made it 611.
Very good. 611. Yes, that's right.
613.
It's 611. So it's 400 for Tav, 200 for Reish, 6 for Vav, 5 for Hey, which adds up to 611, which of course lead to a very interesting sermon about Torah itself equals 611. What are the other two things missing? Because we think of 613 commandments in the Torah. You can see how you can interpret things that are otherwise meaningless from these connections. And the assumption of all mysticism is that things that seem meaningless are not meaningless, right? Coincidence, correspondence, it implies there's meaning to this because of the fact that numbers and letters are understood to be the basic building blocks of the universe. What's our next one? Anyone know what our next one is, what the word is and what it equals?
Secret. Sod.
Good. I don't know who said that. And what's it equal?
Oh, I had it. I didn't write it down. 60, 66,
It's 70. 70.
70. Good. Almost there, Amir. Was that you, Amir? 70. Okay.
Yeah, it was, yeah.
And the next one here is meant to be yayin. I wrote it as a vav, but it's meant to be a final noon. Assuming it's yayin, what does yayin mean and what does it equal here?
It's wine. 26 as written.
Yes, as written, 26. I apologize once more. That should be a noon, a final noon instead of a vav, in which case it would be 70, 50, 10, 10. And that's one of the most famous gematria equations people will use, is that yayin, which is wine, and sod, which is secret, both equal 70. And the implication is that yayin and sod are the same, that if you drink wine, secrets will emerge, which not untrue. And there's another famous equation here in these last three, right? What's this word and what's it equal? Very simple one, very easy.
3.
3, and the word is?
Oh.
Av, which means?
Father.
Father, thank you. And the one below it is?
Mother.
Mother.
Mother. Aim.
Emma.
Yep, aim, which equals what?
61.
61.
41. So
41.
sorry about that. It's an easy one to confuse. Samech is 60, but that's a mem, a final mem, which is 40, 41. So we have av, which is 3, aim, which is 41, and this word yeled is child, and that equals what?
44.
44. So if you literally add father and mother, you get child, right? Coincidence? Not according to the mystics. And what they're looking for when they meditate are things like this, right? Things that disclose the secret meaning beneath the apparent meaning. And that's the purpose of doing this, is try and see insight by using this translation of letters into numbers. Okay. I've just seen something in the chat here. Yes, thank you, David. Yes. So here, let's look at another version of this letters and numbers business now as well. So one way that you can do mess around with letters and numbers is not just to exchange them, but also to interpolate them, to permute them. And this is a very common technique in these meditation schools as well, as permutation, right? Permutation, meaning you see how many different anagrams of a word there are. So I'm just showing you an example here. This is the phrase Adonai Melech, right? God's name, and Melech, which is king, something we see very often in the liturgy. If you wanted to sit down and find all the permutations of this, I just started doing it by changing the letters around. I only did a few, but in fact, there's 5,040 versions of these 7 letters arranged in different ways, right? And that is one of the exercises that you can do as a meditation. And you can do this in English, by the way. You don't have to do this in Hebrew, although because we have this particular focus on the letters of the Hebrew alphabet, there's something nice about doing it in Hebrew. And you don't actually need to know what the Hebrew means in order to do this. But it's again, something that fills up your brain, fills up your cognitive capabilities. If you take any word and you try and write down what all the permutations of it are. Now, the more letters, the more the number of permutations goes up exponentially, right? Like logarithmically goes up. So 7 letters is 5,000 different, over 5,000 different actual versions of it, which can be very hard to make sure you write them all, but actually a very good exercise. But let's look at a shorter version of a couple words here, right? We have a couple words here, some of which we saw before. Let's just take the word emet, right? Now this is easy because there's only 3 letters. So take 1 minute and try and write out all the permutations of this letter, these letters, Aleph, Mem, Tav, for the word emet, which is truth. How many different ways can you write that? What have we got? Who knows how many we got?
Is it 14?
14.
Is it 6?
6. Yeah,
I got 6. Yeah.
6.
Without repeating the letters. So it depends whether you do repetitions. Without repeating letters, just taking these letters, there's 6 varieties. Aleph, mem, tav, aleph, tav, mem, aleph, tav, mem, tav, aleph, mem, aleph. Right? And you can almost do that in your head, although some of those are the same, and that's why you end up with 6 and not 9. Let's try and do the same thing with the next one, with 4 letters. This is the word shamayim. This will take a few minutes. See if you can write out. I'm going to tell you how many. There's 24 factorial. There's 24 versions of this. See if you can find what all the 24 versions in a short period of time.
Can I just say, whilst people are working that out, the fact that you're using paper to work it out lessens the effectiveness of meditation.
Well, David, you spoiled it because we're going to do the next 2 in our
Oh,
minds.
sorry. Sorry. I knew I shouldn't speak.
God forbid that should be your takeaway. But absolutely, it's a learning process. Doing it on paper is much easier because you can look
What's the
and
calculator? Also, the fact that you said bring a calculator. Also, do it without a calculator.
See. Yeah, we'll get there.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, that's true. If you don't know how many factorial it is, you can write any number and an exclamation point is the factorial symbol to see what the permutations of it are. Non-repetitive permutations.
Adam, can I ask a quick question?
Yeah, please.
Is there any instances where there's a hyphen, where a word is hyphenated, and then do you count the hyphen or do you not count the hyphen?
There's not any. So when we're doing work like this, meditation wise, the only thing that matters is letters. And part of the thing is in Hebrew, of course, there's no punctuation. So that's easy, right? Because you don't need to worry about counting any punctuation. There is a hyphen type mark, which is often used in biblical Hebrew, called a makaf, but it's not actually it's not a letter. It's just there to kind of show stress usually, or to show that something's not stressed. So in doing this sort of thing, those are relevant.
So there's not like a crazy gematria where they use vowels and switch those around too and add those into the permutations?
There are versions of gematria which use vowels and assign them numbers, but that's like quite complicated, as you might imagine. And there are, as David also correctly pointed out, there are some that count the final letters as higher numbers as well. So they count final noon as 500, 600, 700. So you can get to larger numbers that way. There's a variety of ways of doing it, but this is the basic thing, is just taking the letters and either replacing them for numbers or playing around with it a little bit.
You're not worried about the order of the letters then?
The order doesn't matter. You don't have to keep the first letter in the first place. You can switch up the order, but you can't repeat. You have to use those 4 letters in whatever way.
I've got myself a bit confused because the mem, does you have to worry about which way around they go?
No, you could just count it as 2 mems.
So you count, and do they count doubly? You know, when you're
well, you could mark it as mem 1 and mem 2, which would get your full 24. Otherwise, it'll appear that many of them are repetitions because they're the same letter. So the ideal circumstance is to use a word which doesn't have repeated letters. And the other way you could do that correctly, Diana, is just to keep the final mem in the form it is, so you can see which, like you're doing the game with the shell game, you can see where the final mem went and where the other mem went and play around with it. But to be honest, it's mostly in the exercise, right? There's no magic that happens when you get the right amount of the right thing. It's the stimulation of doing it as an exercise. Okay, now I want to see if someone's really brave and can do this out loud mentally without writing it down. And I'm going to volunteer David since he volunteered himself. And because I know he could do it. David, will you show us how you could take this word, sod, which we've seen before, which is secret, and run through the permutations of it?
So you've got samach vav daled, samach daled vav, vav samach daled, vav daled samach, daled samach vav, and daled vav samach.
Okay, very good. So does everyone see how you can do that? It's quite straightforward with 3 letters. If you were to do that mentally with 4, it becomes considerably harder, not just a little bit harder, considerably harder with 4 letters than 3, but it is feasible. Anyone want to try the same with our last word here, which is iron? Anyone feel like they want to run through that out loud? By the way, saying it out loud is a big part of it, right? Putting into your mouth the words and the letters themselves and getting that focus. Any brave volunteers?
Go on, I'll try.
Ah!
So we've got iron, yud, nun, iron, nud, nud, iron, nun, yud, yud, iron, nun, yud, nun, iron, and nun, iron, yud, nun, yud, iron.
Very good. Very nice. A really good example of how just kind of running through this, it becomes almost meditative in its own right, you can imagine. And partially it's significant that it doesn't really mean anything. The word iron means an I, right? It's also the letter iron. And you can potentially see in the different versions of that other words, right? So if you're familiar with Hebrew, you'll notice that one of the anagrams is ya'an, which is he answered. Another acronym is, I don't know what the other ones might be, but you could find others actually. And you can do that with any word. And sometimes there is meaning in the anagrams of something. And if you're not comfortable with Hebrew, do that in English. Take an English word, go through those permutations, see what other words come up for anagrams. Also, it'll make you really good at Scrabble, right? If you do this for fun, you will be an absolute wizard at Scrabble because you can see letters and rearrange them mentally into a meaningful word, which is, of course, what Scrabble is all about, or words with friends, or whatever it is. Great. So, any questions about that? Thoughts? You've really got to try these things in more depth to get a good sense of them. Now, this is another one. This I've got to zoom out for, I believe, because I don't think it's fully on the screen. Is that right? So give me a second here. Let's get our toolbar back. Where's my toolbar? Okay, let's just zoom out like that. Can you see the whole thing? You're going to need to see the whole thing. There we go. Okay. I'm not going to tell you what this is. You have a calculator. Take a minute. Try and figure out what this is and tell me its meaning. I see Jackie pointing. Anyone know what this is or have a guess of it?
I think it adds up the same in all directions.
Very good, Jeff and Janice.
505.
505. And well done. So that's correct. Every single row and every single column and every diagonal, at least the 2 diagonals which are complete, add up to the same number, which is 505, while using every digit between 1 and 100. It's quite magic, yes? It's called a magic square, as you might imagine. Not terribly different from Sudoku, as we discussed earlier. What did you see when you were looking at this? Whether you started adding up the rows or the columns or just looked for a pattern, what struck you?
You can see that it compensates. So on the top row, you've got single digits and then, well, apart from the 10, and then digits in the 90s. And the next row, you've got a compensation there in terms of the tens column. You've got the 80s and then the additional tens, and then the 70s and the 20s. So you've got those like number bond pairs compensating as you go down.
Number bonds. Cool.
Good
Good word. I like it.
Exactly. So that's one way to look at it, right? You can see the relationships between numbers. Did anyone's brain just start looking for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and just counting up through the square? And you followed a visual pattern across the square, right? It's a different type of thinking, different type of learner. The artists among us probably went 1, 2, 3, where's 4, where's 5, and tried to trace them all through. You could draw a line going through to 1 to 100 and see what shape it makes. Anything else? What else did your brain do when presented with this grid of 100 numbers?
I kind of saw the small ones at either end, so top and bottom. So the differential got smaller as you went to the middle and then outwards again. So there were lots of single digits and big digits. I'm not a very mathematical brain at all, but I saw the single digits at the top and the bottom, and lots of 50s and 40s in the middle. So it was the visual patterns that struck me.
Really interesting. So there's kind of a central concentration of middle numbers, and the extremes you can see visibly on the edge. So you identified a kind of bullseye almost, Jeff.
Which kind of equates with how I learn, because I have terrible maths anxiety.
Oh, so sorry.
But so this is killing me. But now we've got some visuals, I'm a bit happier.
Good. We're gonna go on as well to some speaking bits as well, so don't worry. Very good, very interesting. Now this is obviously a practice called magic squares, and as you can imagine, this is another similar method to take letters and numbers and use the contemplation of them as a way to fill up your brain with activity. Now, analyzing or looking at one of these is one thing, right? Obviously quite challenging, and figuring out what the sum is that all of them equal is fairly straightforward once you know to look for it. What's more challenging is actually trying to write one. This is a little bit from one of Kaplan's book about the magic square system, just as some background and to show the depth of this, right? Kaplan is talking about magic squares, and one particular rabbi who wrote the main book on this sort of practice. And he says that, there's language about this. Each horizontal row is called a house, while each number is called a room. And he talks about the 10th order, which is the one that we've just seen. And then there's this teaching that in the meditation system, each one of the numbers represents 10 million parasangs, that's a distance, right? A kind of astronomical distance, and 10 million shades of a different color. And as one mentally travels from room to room, from house to house, going through the magic square, one must apparently attempt to depict these lights. So there's this notion behind here of a greater depth, actually, that you start out kind of looking at the maths, and then actually there's a visualization behind that. It's very hard to understand exactly what he means. And the idea is that you can look at the information in front of you and use it to consume your mental processes, and in the meantime enter a sort of trance-like state. And clearly it is a trance-like state, because Kaplan tells us that there's considerable discussion as to whether one should meditate alone or with an instructor. And Rav Siach, the guy who primarily teaches this, he's 16th century, 17th century, he says it's necessary for the initiate's master to stand over them the first time until they become accustomed to entering these states. One's master can help them come back to a normal state of consciousness, lest one gaze and lose their mind. So there's a certain degree of seriousness to this sort of thing, that if you really consume your mind doing this, you can actually kind of lose touch with reality, which I think we can probably envision. That if you follow that advice of Abulafia, you fast for 3 days in a completely isolated location, and you have complete focus on this, it could really be destabilizing in a way that's both productive in terms of spiritual development, but also quite dangerous, right? Abulafia spent the last 20 years of his life living on an island called Comino, which is, if anyone's been to Malta, Comino is one of this tiny islands as part of the Maltese archipelago, and there's literally no one who lives on it. Right? He built a house on an island where he was the only human being and lived there for 20 years. And that was his goal, to try and achieve these meditation techniques, was total isolation. Isolation these days is both a very familiar thing because of our lockdown and a very impossible thing because everyone's living in small quarters with each other. But there is something very powerful about actually kind of identifying a time or a space where you can be isolated and focus entirely on one thing. And ultimately, that's what makes for successful meditation. Now, take a minute and see if you can write the 3 order square. It's a different task to write it than to analyze it. Can you put the numbers, and it's the numbers 1 through 9, in a square where all of them add up to the same number? Anyone get it? I see some people trying to do it on paper and some people trying to do it in their mind.
I do.
Who's that?
Michelle.
Michelle?
Yeah, I think
Did
I
you get
can
it?
do I think so.
All right. Tell us what it looks like. Does it look like this?
No. Are they going to be different numbers? Oh, okay. No, I haven't got it.
Sorry.
Okay, I do it differently. Okay. Okay. I'll
Wait,
have
what did you do? I'm curious.
Oh, I did 3. I just did similar to the when you were putting
I
them
see.
orders, just to make them add up all to the same thing all the time. So much simpler. Okay.
Yeah. Either way is probably a very good exercise.
Okay.
But in order to fit the 9 digits, the 9 single digits, into a 3x3 square, it has to look like this. It could be this rotated, by the way.
Okay.
So if you've done it and yours has got different ones, different positions, it doesn't matter as long as they're in the same organization. And if you look at this, all 3 rows and all 3 columns add up to 15, as do the diagonals. 15, 15, 15, 15, 15, all around. Okay. In addition, there's something special about this one, which is that if you take any 2 numbers on opposite sides of the square, they add up to 10. Right. 1 and 9, 6 and 4, 8 and 2, etc. On opposite the diagonals and the corners, which is pretty cool. 3 and 7 on the other side. This is a really hard thing to do, right? Anyone get close to doing it this way, or come up with this? I don't know if there is a way to do it mentally. I'm not quite so advanced to be able to do this in my head. I think there probably is. But one way to do it, the probably best way to do it, is trial and error. You put a number in, you try and figure out what other numbers you need. You keep changing it. Definitely a pencil job and not a pen one. But actually, if you really focused on trying to figure it out, it's almost like a Rubik's Cube, right? You just have to keep trying it and keep moving it and keep figuring out and remember what happened and work it. It is totally consumptive. It's a very simple exercise. Take the 9 single digits and put them in a 3x3 square that adds up to the same thing, but it's actually very complex to do. All the more so if you had to come up with the 100 square, right? Can you imagine the complexity? Someone had to come up with that. I didn't. I just copied that out of a book. But someone had to come up with how to arrange the 100 numbers from 1 to 100 to make 505 on every side. That would have taken a tremendous amount of focus and time. And that's exactly the idea. And just to point out, I know we've been working with numbers, but remember, numbers are letters and letters are numbers. So you can also depict this exact same square as Hebrew letters. Right? This is just directly translated from the numbers to depict as the letters. And here you can make other interesting connections, perhaps meaning connections between different letters or different sounds and how they connect to each other, in addition to the numerical significance, which is all still there. Okay, still with me? All right, one more thing to show you and to talk about a little bit, which is all of this stuff to do on paper is a big part of it. But actually it's not the entire part of it, because there's also quite a few ways in which we apply this sort of thinking about letters and numbers and sounds to what we might anticipate to be a more expected meditation. And this is a very, very basic form of one of those things that Abu Lafia taught. And what I'm going to do is explain this to us, and then we're going to try and do it together. Okay? So this is not pen or paper or a calculator. This is sitting comfortably, listening to the instructions, trying to do it at home. So first, let me just explain what we're looking at. So this is a simple meditation in which you take the 4 letters of God's name, Yud, Hey, Vav, and Hey, starting on the left-hand side with Yud. That's why I put number 1 there. And you take the 5 main vowels, O, A, A, E, and U. That's 6. I can count. I've realized I'm teaching you math. I can't count. There's 6 main vowels. And what you do is go through a system of moving your head to the 6 directions around you in correspondence with the 6 sounds and a breathing pattern. It's a lot to think about at once, right? Which is the idea, right? The idea is that it's a lot to think about at once. So the first step, and I'm going to talk it through and then we're going to do it. The first step is you inhale through your nose always. And then as you inhale, for the first one, you move your head forward in front of you. All right, 6 directions. Remember the lulav at Sukkot. Move your head forward and inhale. Then as you exhale, you move your head back to the center and you put the first letter with the first sound, yo. You say, yo. Then you inhale and move your head to the right. And then you move back to the center as you exhale and say, yeah. Then you inhale and move your head backwards. And as you exhale, you move back to the center and say, yay. Try and breathe the sound into your breath. Then you inhale and move your head left. And as you exhale, you move back to the center. Yee. Inhale and move your head upward. And as you exhale, you move back to the center. Yeah. Then you inhale and move your head down all the way to your chest. And you exhale, you move back to the center. You. Okay? Those sounds, just to repeat them, I'm just going to do it once without explaining the instructions, just to show you. So you inhale and move forward. Yo. Yeah. Yay. Yee. Yeah. You. Then you start with hey. Inhale, really big inhales and short exhales. So once again, forward. Ho. Ha. Hey. He. Huh. Who. Right, all these sounds, and then a big breath at the end, and then you go back and do vo, va, ve, vi, ve, vu, and then again hey, ho, ha, hey, he, he, who. Questions about that? You want to try it? You gotta try it with me. All right, the 6 directions are forward, then right, then back, then left, then up, then down. I expect you to remember this at Sukkot, because that is how you shake the lulav. In front of you, to the right, behind you, to the left, up, and down. Those are the 6 directions. There's 3 dimensions in which your body is currently: front and back, right and left, up and down, right? X, Y, Z. 2 sides of 3 directions. And you're using all 3 dimensions in order to do that. So you're moving front, then right, then back, then left, then up, then down. And you're moving through O, A, A, E, U. And you're combining it with the different letters starting with Yud. So we're all on mute, so you can do it safely. No one will realize you're embarrassed. Let's try and do it together. We'll go fairly slowly. So I'm not going to give the instructions, but try and follow along with me. Remember, breathe in through your nose with your mouth shut, and then exhale through your mouth. If you do this quite seriously, you will get lightheaded. That's okay, you're sitting down. Okay, ready? Yeah. 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 Yee. Yeah. You. Oh. Hey. He. Who. Vo. Va. They. V. V. Who. Ho. Ha. Hey. He. Hey. Who. Feel a bit lightheaded? Yeah, I can see Jeff does.
It just made me yawn all the time. I don't know why, it just set me off completely. I just yawned the whole way through it.
Maybe that's not a bad thing.
Oh, no, it's fine.
It is. So one of the things I think that that maybe is surprising is that meditation, I always feel like it makes my brain very clear, right? Kind of like a shot of espresso. And by the way, that's just one repetition through this cycle. If you did that nonstop for an hour and you had it memorized and you didn't have to think about it and you just moved and said and moved and said and breathed, you would have the opportunity to just really tune out and listen very carefully. And that's what's quite amazing, actually. Meditation is a practice, right? What we looked at today is just a little hint of some of these techniques. Some of them are very basic. If you want to take a few minutes to meditate each day, simply sit down and pick a word out of your random imagination in English or Hebrew or any other language and write all the anagrams of it and try only to think about that. Or try and do the magic square, right? Try and just figure out which way it goes together. Or switch, take the gematria, even print out the sheet with the letters and numbers and switch things back and forth and back and forth. And try and just do that, and you will find that actually it does become more comfortable and it does become something which consumes your focus. The breathing, speaking, moving is a little hint of some of the other things we'll do next time and in the future. We'll do this more in depth because that's a big part of it as well. Your breath is something that you do all the time. You don't think about it, right? And at very few points you go, okay, breathe in, okay, breathe out. You don't have to, but it happens. If it didn't happen, there would be a problem. And there's so many automatic processes that happen, not only in your body in terms of your breathing and your heart rate and your movements, but also in terms of your mind. All sorts of things happen and occur to you and you think without thinking of, without directing your thought. And all of these techniques and all the ones we'll see in other sessions are about focusing your thoughts and thinking on purpose, right? That's what meditation is, thinking on purpose. And there's many, many ways you can do that. It's not about relaxation per se. It might be relaxing. It might be exhausting, right? Lorraine is yawning on us. It might be exhausting to actually do this. You might, if you did the letter permutations for an hour, you might find that you absolutely have a headache. But if you keep doing that for an hour every day, you will find that it not necessarily is relaxing, but it allows you to achieve a non-normal state of consciousness. the way that drugs or ecstatic experiences or really profound moments in your life might, you can do that every day in small ways simply by using practices like these in order to develop a routine. And it is a practice, and it is something that requires practice to get better at. But hopefully it's been a little window into how you can do those sort of things and how basic they can be. And for these ones, all of these, the gematria, the letter switching and number switching, the letter permutation, the magic squares, and Abulafia's breathing, right, all of them are based on the idea that the letters and the numbers are what actually creates the world around us. And by using language and playing with language, we can engage as God does with creation. And that's a pretty profound idea, something that we do all the time, speaking, and yet very rarely think about what power it has. So any questions, thoughts, comments before we wrap up for this evening on who's going to start doing this every day?
You said it was about thinking on purpose, but I think it's more about not thinking on purpose.
Well,
because the aim of meditation is to get rid of thoughts in your mind. And as you meditate, what tends to happen is your mind starts wandering and you start thinking about other things. What's on TV? What am I going to eat for dinner, etc. The point is, as soon as you realize your mind is wandering, then you immediately switch back to the thing that you're meant to be thinking of. And the more you do it, you'll find that your mind starts wandering less and less.
Yes, indeed, it is a muscle. And the biggest challenge to meditation, whether it is the stillness, quiet kind, or the very busy overstimulation kind, is that all of the normal automatic processes happen. You go, oh, I forgot to do that thing. And that'll happen even while you're so busy doing this. But like you said, Jeff, if you bring yourself back to it, and it's a little bit easier, I think, by the way, doing this type when there's something to do, as opposed to just sitting quietly, then it helps just to get stronger at it. I think personally, the sitting quietly meditation doesn't work for me, right? Because I just cannot remain in that state without something to do, something to think about. And so in some way, giving yourself something to think about, something fairly meaningless, but which is stimulating and challenging, allows you in a different way to get to that state where you're not thinking, right? By thinking so hard about something like this, you're allowing yourself to not think about things you normally would, and you're able to listen actually to what's in the background. Like all the things that occur to you at moments that you're really busy. It's always when you're doing something else that your brain goes, oh, what about this?
Almost counting sheep to put yourself to sleep.
Yes, good example. Yeah, right. Although I don't actually know what that means, whether you're supposed to imagine sheep, but the idea, right, of kind of doing something mundane and repetitive and consuming is that it allows you to kind of shut off otherwise normal processes.
Well, when you do that counting, the thing is, the more tired you get, the more involved you get. You lose the number and you use your train of thought, and then you've got to go back to it, and that's the whole idea.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know if anybody knows the code breaker puzzles, because they you get like all the numbers put into like a grid, and you've got to work out from the patterns of the numbers what letters they represent. So I love them.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. That's basically gematria, isn't it? English is a bit harder, but it sounds like similar concept. Yeah.
So it's really engaging, but it's also quite analytic as well.
Yeah. Really interesting.
They're great fun.
I think the big difference I found with this to other forms was how intense the focus is. And it's quite, well, it could be, I imagine, quite anxiety provoking if you don't manage to do it. I was just wondering if it has the same sort of non-judgmental, you know, you've got to be gentle on yourself attitude towards it that I've experienced with other meditations of the more, you know, gentle variety.
Yeah, no doubt about it. It is very absolutely that it is not a competition. And it is meant to be useful, right? It's a functional thing. So there's no right or wrong. There's no better or worse. It's a tool to use and a skill. And like anything, the more you do it, the easier it gets. But it's not about being perfect, right? It's about finding something that allows you to focus your mind in order to kind of allow the rest of it to go blurry, right? If anyone's a photographer, you can really imagine it very well. And that if you focus on one object in the picture, really detailed, especially with a very close lens, everything else blurs out. And that's ultimately what we're trying to do here, is just focus on something enough to allow the rest of it to kind of fade into the background, to blur out. Like those pictures where it looks random, but if you look at it the right way, you can see a penguin. Do you know what I mean? Right? That's what this is. And there's no right or wrong way to do that. You do have to be gentle with yourself. And it often does require support from other people or from teachers. It is hard to do in isolation. But the eventual goal is to have a resource that you can use anytime in any place that simply is with you in order to offer that opportunity to simply direct your thoughts. And it is very empowering to find that you do have that control, to retake the control of your mind. It can be a very empowering experience.
Sadly, I've never seen the penguin, so I'm hoping for better luck with this one.
I hope so too. I always struggle with those as well. The duck or the rabbit. Really a privilege to have you guys here with us tonight. Thank you for joining us. Hopefully it's been an interesting exercise. I will post the sheets as well as the video on